Welcome to a world of hidden intrigues and grand ballrooms, where royal romance and aristocratic secrets converge in a tale almost too astonishing to be true. Today we uncover the life of Lady Rosemary Leveson-Gower, a nurse on the front lines of World War I, a dazzling society figure, and a woman whose near-royal engagement could have changed British history forever. Ready to peer behind the gilded doors of nobility? Let's embark on this captivating journey together. In the hushed corridors of Scottish nobility, where the echo of ancestral voices seemed to reverberate through ancient stone walls, Lady Rosemary Millicent Leveson-Gower began her life at Dunrobin Castle on August 9, 1893. It was a place that dazzled the senses. Great windows, letting in the pale northern sunlight, tapestries soaked in centuries of history, and grounds that rolled out to meet the wild sea. Even as a little girl, Rosemary was said to be perpetually curious, gazing out over the headlands with bright, inquisitive eyes. Her father, Cromarty Sutherland Leveson-Gower, 4th Duke of Sutherland, had inherited land, titles, and a formidable fortune. But along with that wealth came the burden of controversy. Much of the estate's riches were linked to the Highland clearances, a centuries-old wound in the Scottish memory. Her mother, Lady Millicent Fanny St. Clair Erskine, known by many as Meddlesome Millie, was a powerhouse in her own right, a social reformer and nurse with a flair for drawing both admirers and critics. This was the environment into which Rosemary emerged, a curious child surrounded by love, privilege, and a swirl of gossip that she had yet to understand. From the moment she took her first steps across the polished floors of Dunrobin, Rosemary possessed a certain luminous quality that people remarked upon again and again. She might have been the youngest of 4 children, but she swiftly learned to navigate a realm of nannies, tutors, and staff who hovered around her family, catering to their every need. The castle, with its turrets and archways and hidden passages, felt to Rosemary like a magical kingdom. She would slip away from her attendants to wander through the echoing halls, trailing fingertips across ancient suits of armor and pressed velvet chairs that told silent stories of hunts and feasts long past. When she looked out from the highest tower, the wind lifting her hair, she would imagine her future as wide open and boundless as the ocean below. Yet from an early age, a shadow tugged at the edges of her shiny world. Rumors and resentments circulated beyond the castle walls. Her father's ancestors were deeply entangled in the forced removal of tenant farmers from their lands, a historical injustice that lingered in the folk memory of Scotland. Whispers also followed her mother, the irrepressible Lady Millicent, whose high-profile advocacy and personal life inspired admiration in some circles and derision in others. Certain members of society accused her of meddling, of crossing boundaries that aristocratic wives were supposed to respect, especially in championing the Red Cross and other philanthropic missions. It was a stigma that Rosemary would carry, though she understood little of it at first. She was sheltered, indulged, and yet taught the importance of appearances, taught to present herself with grace, dignity, and a touch of aloofness that would keep the scandalous murmurings at bay. By the time she made her social debut in 1911, Rosemary had grown into a strikingly poised young woman. She learned to waltz in shimmering ball gowns, to hold sparkling conversation at garden parties, and to wear the family's inherited jewels with a regal elegance that left admirers in awe. Yet behind her polished smiles at debutante balls, she wrestled with the swirling complexities of her family's legacy. There was a sense that no matter how perfectly she curtsied or how gracefully she navigated society's labyrinth of etiquette, she could never outrun the controversies tied to her surname. Some in the aristocratic circles were enchanted by the grace and style with which she carried herself. Others watched from the side, refusing to forget the darker corners of the Sutherland story. Beneath the glamour, Rosemary felt something akin to longing. She yearned for a life that would allow her to stand on her own merits, to be loved for who she was beyond the crest on her stationery, or the formal titles that floated around her like ribbons. Her world, and the world at large, soon changed dramatically. With the outbreak of the First World War, that seemingly unassailable bubble of aristocratic indulgence began to fracture. Across Europe, centuries-old empires were cracking under the strain of total conflict, and a spirit of urgency touched even the most pampered drawing rooms of Britain. For Rosemary, no longer content just to read about battles in the daily papers, it was time to follow her mother's footsteps in the field of nursing. Lady Millicent had poured her energy into the Red Cross, organizing hospitals and encouraging her circle of society ladies to roll up their sleeves for the war effort. And so Rosemary, with her mother's blessing, set aside some of the shimmering gowns and took on the stark uniform of a voluntary aid detachment, VAD nurse. She was only in her early 20s, and friends whispered about how striking she looked in that simple nurse's attire, her hair tucked beneath a cap. But beyond appearances, Rosemary found herself shaken awake by the realities of war, the ravaged bodies and fractured spirits of the soldiers who came under her care. It was in the midst of this upheaval that Rosemary encountered Edward, Prince of Wales, the man who would later be known to the world as Edward VIII, and who would scandalize the British public with his abdication. In 1917, at a Red Cross hospital in France that Lady Millicent had helped establish, fate brought Rosemary and the young prince together. He was 23, not yet disillusioned, but certainly weighed down by the wartime tragedies and the formidable expectations of the crown. She was 24, gentle-eyed, competent, and sympathetic, tending to wounded men who saw her as an angelic figure. The story goes that Edward became mesmerized by her presence. Perhaps it was her kindness that drew him, or her unforced elegance, or simply the calm way in which she moved around men whose nightmares followed them long after the guns fell silent. To the outside world, their attraction seemed inevitable. A handsome prince, a beautiful nurse with aristocratic ties brought together by war and longing for normalcy amid the chaos. Society soon buzzed with rumors. The pair danced at modest wartime gatherings, where champagne was harder to come by, but the emotional stakes seemed amplified by the uncertainties of the front. They took drives together in the French countryside, windows rolled down to let the warm wind tousle their hair and carry away the tension of war. Those who witnessed them could scarcely contain their excitement, particularly because Edward had a reputation for being somewhat reserved. With Rosemary, he laughed more freely, lingered in conversation, and found himself genuinely captivated by her devotion. Seeing her soothe a shell-shocked soldier with quiet words and gentle hands, their chemistry blazed into a romance, one that was all the more enchanting for happening amidst the heartbreak and darkness of a global conflict. When news of their courtship reached British high society, it ignited speculation that soared higher than the highest towers at Dunrobin. After all, to marry a prince, especially the Prince of Wales, was an aspiration many young ladies dared not even whisper. And in Rosemary's case, gossip columns latched onto the story that Edward was so smitten he might propose. According to friends close to the situation, he did exactly that, offering her a diamond ring and dreams of a shared future. At first, Rosemary was hesitant. She liked him, admired his sense of duty, and felt drawn to the lonely vulnerability he displayed when away from the constraints of palace life. But the prospect of becoming a future queen was daunting. Could she withstand the pressure? Would her family baggage, the so-called checkered background that the royal family eyed warily, cast too dark a shadow over a marriage that could shape the British monarchy? Her acceptance of his proposal was cautious, a whispered yes that came with 1,000 unspoken questions. But unbeknownst to her, the decision was not hers alone to make. King George V and Queen Mary held firm to the Royal Marriages Act 1772, a centuries-old legal barrier designed to protect the crown from potentially problematic unions. Although both the king and queen reportedly liked Rosemary and admired her nursing work, they balked at the idea of her background being linked with the throne. Her mother's scandalous remarriages, first to Percy Fitzgerald, then to George Hawes, had made the wrong kind of headlines. Adding to the swirl of gossip was Rosemary's uncle James, the 5th Earl of Rosslyn, whose gambling debts and multiple divorces had long fueled scorn. And overshadowing them all was perhaps the most notorious relative, her half-aunt Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, famed for being one of Edward VII's former mistresses. In the eyes of a monarchy deeply enmeshed with the Church of England, these were insurmountable stains. A future queen needed an unblemished pedigree, or at least one that could be presented as such. When George V and Queen Mary drew a line in the sand, Edward found himself cornered by obligations that outranked his own desires. If one listens to the accounts of those in their social circle at the time, Edward was livid. It was said he never fully forgave his father for blocking the marriage and for failing to see that Rosemary's heart outweighed whatever so-called scandal her family had accumulated. Some confidants believed this heartbreak was a pivot point for Edward, nudging him toward a pattern of falling for women who were, in the view of the establishment, equally or more unsuitable than Rosemary ever was. It laid the groundwork, they say, for his later involvement with Wallis Simpson, a divorcee who would spark an international crisis and lead to his abdication. Rosemary herself perhaps instinctively sensing that fighting the monarchy would be a losing battle, retreated with dignity. Publicly, she claimed that she had never truly wanted to become a princess, that her romance with Edward had been more about friendship, duty, and affection than about ascending to the throne. Whether that was a genuine sentiment or a way of saving face, we can only guess. Even as the war drew to a close, rumor and regret hovered around them. Society columns that once printed hopeful speculation about a forthcoming royal wedding now reported on the cracks forming between Edward and his family. The scuttled engagement became a whisper that traveled through ballrooms and parlors, fueling cynics who believed that no matter how bright a young woman's charms might be, tradition could crush even the most promising possibilities. Rosemary herself returned to London, poised yet subdued. She resumed a social life that included sparkling parties and charitable gatherings, but acquaintances noted a gravity behind her laughter, as if she carried a private sorrow she seldom shared. And yet life did not stand still. In the turbulent months following her heartbreak, she found companionship in William Ward, Viscount Ednam, an old friend of Prince Edward's, incidentally. William was heir to the Earl of Dudley, a man who balanced aristocratic duties with a zest for parties that made him a fixture among the bright young things of the Roaring Twenties. Perhaps part of Rosemary's attraction to William was that he was, in many ways, Edward's polar opposite, more easygoing, less burdened by the monarchy's demands, and ready to share a worldly life that promised glittering events instead of stuffy palace protocol. They married on March 8, 1919, in a ceremony that drew throngs of onlookers and reporters. British Pathé even captured footage, preserving for posterity the image of Rosemary in her wedding finery, a graceful figure stepping through confetti-strewn air to meet her groom. One might have expected a happily ever after, or at least a storybook union befitting their station. But marriage to William had its own set of challenges. The Ward family was no stranger to high drama, and William himself was rumored to have an eye for extramarital dalliances. Gossip swirled that he had fathered a daughter with Venetia Stanley, a woman whose name was uttered in anxious whispers at London soirée. Rosemary, for her part, remained a figure of fascination. She was seen conversing animatedly with Duff Cooper on occasion, drawing further speculation that she, too, might be seeking comfort or excitement outside the bounds of her marriage. Yet nothing was ever proven. Whatever the reality behind the gossip columns, the Ednoms carried on, hosting grand gatherings at Himley Hall that featured champagne towers, jazz bands, and a rotating cast of aristocratic revelers. They became quintessential members of the bright young things, that carefree, glitter-dusted clique that came to define the post-war spirit, seeking joy and revelry to mask the lingering traumas of the battlefield. In public, Rosemary stood by William, supporting his political ventures. She smiled for the cameras when he campaigned for the Conservative Party, demonstrating a sense of duty akin to what she had shown as a nurse. Behind closed doors, she channeled her energies into philanthropic causes, most notably the North Staff's Cripples Aid Society, which she led with compassion and organizational flair. Newspapers documented her drive to raise funds for a new hospital, an ambitious goal of £20,000, a hefty sum in the late 1920s. She seemed determined to shape a legacy that reached beyond shallow gossip, to be remembered not merely for her beauty or her near marriage to a prince, but for the tangible difference she could make in ordinary people's lives. Yet for all her outward determination, a kernel of restlessness seemed to remain, an undercurrent shaped by the heartbreaks and near misses that had marked her young adulthood. Life's intensity only grew as she became a mother. She bore William 3 sons, William in 1920, John in 1922, and Peter in 1926, and also suffered the heartbreak of delivering a stillborn daughter. Motherhood brought fresh purpose and vulnerability, especially for someone who had already come face to face with the fragility of life while nursing war-wounded soldiers. Her second son, John, seemed particularly dear to her. He was a cheerful child, lively and brimming with questions about the world. Rosemary doted on him, guiding him through the gardens at Himley Hall, letting him pick flowers to present at family gatherings, and encouraging his curious mind. When, in December 1929, news raced through the estate that 7-year-old John had been struck by a truck while cycling, it was an unimaginable blow. The child who had reminded her of life's beauty was suddenly gone, and she was left grappling with a fresh wave of grief. To ease her pain, Rosemary poured her energies into building a special garden of remembrance at Himley Hall, a tranquil spot with winding paths and blossoms that she felt spoke to the memory of her lost child. Every newly planted flower was a silent prayer, each shrub a vow not to let John's memory fade into the swirl of aristocratic obligations and social events. Those who visited her there often found her gazing at the green leaves, lost in thought, as if she could sense John's presence in the rustling of the wind. It was a testament to her resilience that, even in profound sorrow, she sought to create something beautiful and enduring. But tragedy, like a merciless pursuer, was not finished with Rosemary. In July of 1930, at 36 years old, she left for Le Touquet, France, to visit William, who was recovering from an illness. Perhaps she needed a short escape from the sadness that clung to her at Himley Hall, or perhaps She simply longed for a moment of marital closeness amid an otherwise frenetic life. On July 21st, 1930, she boarded a Junkers W-33 air taxi to return to England. This was a relatively new era of air travel, filled with a heady optimism that technology would reshape the future. Commercial aviation was still in its infancy. Every flight carried a certain risk, but few aristocrats gave that much thought. It was modern, it was quick, and it was the sort of thrilling convenience that high society was adopting with gusto. The plane carried a notable group: Rosemary herself, the Marquess of Dufferin, Sir Edward Ward, Mrs. Sigrid Loeffler, and of course the crew: pilot Lieutenant Colonel George Henderson and co-pilot Charles Shearing. Everything seemed normal at takeoff. Then, high above the Kentish countryside, something went catastrophically wrong. Eyewitness accounts described how the aircraft appeared to disintegrate midair, shedding a wing as if it were a piece of paper caught in a gust of wind. In the span of seconds, the promise of safety gave way to absolute horror. The plane plummeted into the fields below and all aboard lost their lives. Harold Ward, no relation to the aristocratic Wards, but an unfortunate bystander who saw the wreckage fall, later recounted the surreal horror of it. The way parts of the fuselage seemed to flutter downward, the distant screams that mingled with the roar of the engine, and then the deafening silence once the impact came. In a ghastly twist, rumors circulated that Edward, Rosemary's former suitor, had originally planned to be on that very flight but changed his plans at the last minute. Whispers of sabotage or foul play swirled, though no conclusive evidence ever emerged. Some pointed to structural failure, a tragic mechanical flaw in an era when aviation regulations were not what they are today. Others hinted at conspiracies, spun from the knowledge that anything touching the royal family often carried labyrinthine complexities. When rescuers arrived, they found the victims unrecognizable, except, in Rosemary's case, for the string of pearls she wore. Those pearls, luminous even in the debris, testified to the bright spirit that had once enchanted a prince and brought a touch of compassion to wounded soldiers. News of the disaster thundered through British society. In those days, plane crashes were still a rarity. To lose multiple high-profile individuals at once seemed unimaginably tragic. Edward, upon hearing the news, was said to be inconsolable. According to accounts from staffers, he wept openly, disregarding the royal dictum to maintain composure, and was haunted by what might have been, both in terms of his personal history with Rosemary and the sheer fragility of life. Rosemary's remains, once formally identified, were laid to rest in the Garden of Remembrance at Himley Hall, that same space she had designed to commemorate her beloved son. Later, her final resting place would be transferred to Dornoch Cathedral graveyard. Even so, a sense of her presence lingered at Himley Hall, in the blossoming flowers she had chosen with such care, in the hush of the pathway she had once walked with her children. People said that whenever Edward passed through that region, he would grow quiet, lost in the swirl of memories. The aura of the bright young things, once so carefree and decadent, dimmed in the face of this tragedy, a stark reminder that all the glitz in the world could not safeguard them from fate's caprice. Despite the brevity of her life, Rosemary left behind footprints that cannot be erased. As a nurse, she earned an Associate Royal Red Cross ARRC in 1919, honoring her dedication to soldiers ravaged by a war that reshaped the global order. As a socialite, she navigated the labyrinth of aristocratic rituals, balancing grace and generosity with the ever-present burden of her family's controversies. In marriage, she fought to maintain a sense of self, an impressive feat, given her husband's dalliances and the gossip that surrounded them. and as a mother, she poured her soul into her children, willing to carry a mother's deepest fear, only to face that fear realized when tragedy took young John. Through all of it, she remained at her core a woman of empathy and resilience, one whose story offers a glimpse into the human costs hidden behind the grand facades of aristocracy.